Australasia, and a Fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia and the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, a Chartered Secretary, with 30 years' experience in the information disciplines, both in Australia and in the United Kingdom. He has implemented and managed records and information management programs in state and Commonwealth public sector agencies for over 20 years. Chris holds an Associate Diploma of Arts, Library Practice, a Bachelor of Applied Science Information Studies, a Master of Arts, Information and Knowledge Management, and a Graduate Diploma in Applied Corporate Governance. Where do you get the time? He is currently a doctoral candidate and sessional lecturer in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. Chris's doctoral research focuses on the perceptions of records in Australian public sector agencies in this time of digital transition. He is particularly interested in the socially constructed nature of records and the various influences on professionals, constructions of records as part of their everyday practices in the digital age. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. So before I begin, a few thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to the agencies who've allowed me to do this research. Without that, that would not have been possible. For obvious confidentiality reasons, I can't tell you who they are, but they know who they are, and I will forever be in their debt. To Rimpa, who gave me a research grant to pay for some of the transcription of the interviews. You know, obviously doing this research part-time while you still have a full-time job, you know, doing all that is labour-intensive, so that actually helped speed up the process. So thank you. And also to the Australian government, who, of course, has the Australian government's research training scheme, which, of course, allows PhD students to actually subsidises the PhDs. So they're actually on the last slide, but I wanted to do that first. But also before I begin, I think I know the answer I'm going to get, but how many people here have ever had to explain what a record is to an end user? Yeah, thought so. And so that was partly the impetus for my research. I guess it was, but also some of you may remember Margaret Pember. Margaret Pember asked me to write an article on the link between good corporate governance and good records management after I kind of became a chartered secretary. And I started reading all the corporate governance literature, and I started reading all the records management literature, and yeah, guess what? The same thing was described quite differently. You know, so we're the only ones who think about records in the way we talk about it. Hate to tell you, but you probably already know that. So maybe some of these research findings won't be quite how shall I say, earth-shattering to those of you with some experience. But I guess part of the reason I did this research was I actually wanted to put it into the body of knowledge, because without empirical evidence and without actually documenting this, we can't change the whole, I guess, the nature of how records and management is actually implemented, because everyone goes back to the standards and all the other body of knowledge, and if there's nothing there about how actual real users do stuff, you know, we're going to be stuck with the same old things. So I guess that's just a brief intro, and I'll try not to make it too theoretical. I will skip through the theory part, but because it is a doctoral thing, I do have to do some of it. So, you know, and I know theory's not, you know, this is a practitioners' conference, but anyway. So I guess, you know, for me, I think we serve three masters. We serve the organisation in which we work. We serve the record-keeping framework, whether that's the legislative framework or the best practice framework or whatever it is, but we serve that whole idea of best practice record-keeping or compliant record-keeping, and we're the people in the organisation who try and make that happen or actually make the compromises. As someone said yesterday, you know, there's no point having rules for rules' sake, but, you know, we're the mediators between the framework and what actually happens in our organisation. But we also serve our customers, the users. So, you know, we have three actually quite diverse things that we have to kind of balance when we put things in. But actually, there's very little research when you actually go to the literature about users in creating agencies or organisations generally. There's very little. There's some in archival settings, but not in actual organisations. And for me, you know, the success of record keeping is actually dependent on how we engage and how we actually get the records creators to be, you know, records managers, for want of a better term. And if we don't actually engage them and get those records into the systems, you know, and I'm quoting Jenny Evans here, she said that the archives of tomorrow will be full of digital dust, you know, and I kind of get that. But conversely, there is lots of literature around change management and implementation in records management, but really around the implementation of EDRMSs, like, you know, but nothing else, you know. So it's kind of like, you know, it's almost like, well, when you put the system in, everything else disappears, you know. But what happens if you've put the system in? You know, how do you know what your users are thinking before you've put the system in? So I guess my research question was to explore the perceptions of Australian public sector employees with a view to understanding the factors that influence the social construction, and when I say, I'll explain that in a minute, of records in Australian government agencies in the age of digital continuity. You've just had a presentation on the whole digital continuity policy, so you should be pretty up to that. And the secondary question, I guess, was, are the predominant factors that influence that cultural, professional, or personal? You know, what are the things that actually make all that work? Because there's lots of pronouncements about what people think, but no evidence. So, a little bit about practices. So, the title of my presentation is actually linked to a thing called practice theory. And practice theory is actually the basis. Structuration theory is it was one of the early practice theories. It was actually the basis of the records continuum model. So I think we're the only people that practice record keeping as a practice, you know, as a discipline. But for everyone else, record keeping is a practice within a practice. Record keeping happens as part of their own jobs. But social practices, so practices are social. That's the one key thing I want to get across today. And they involve agents, people. They involve knowledge, objects, and routinized forms of conduct. So kind of things that repeated over and over again. They are materially mediated, so we interact with materials. Human activity that are organised around a shared practical understanding. So, and that's, you know, kind of when you think about it, a lot of what we do is mediate on some level that shared practical understanding with the people in our organisations. And theoretically, they can be broken down into, you know, kind of three kinds of themes, and that's the three kinds of themes I'll present my findings in. So doings, like the actual doings, the sayings, well, they're fairly self, and the relatings. And the relatings are kind of, you know, how everything relates together socially and politically. And, you know, there are ecologies or nexuses of practices. So lots of practices in a particular organisational setting, and that's kind of key also to practice theory, is that practices take place, they're site-specific. And lots of practices collide in that site. So that's the theory bit. The rest, we'll leave the theory. But that's kind of key to the title presentation when I say records are practices, not artefacts. So, and in an organisation, you can have, for example, this diagram just trying to say that, now I think it's this button. Maybe it's this button. Intra and extra organisational practice. So when you think about it, this is from a strategy article. But when you think about strategy practitioners, they've got their body of knowledge that they draw from, and they, in the same way we do, we draw from our body of knowledge, our discipline, but actually the way we implement it within an organisation might be slightly different. So you've got the extra-organisational, the intra-organisational practice, and they might not be the same, but they're kind of linked in the same practice, and that's what that diagram is supposed to represent. So let's keep going. So what did I do? I used a case study method. I looked at 4 agencies who had different corporate governance arrangements across the Australian government. And they all had different record keeping and social media maturity. But the key point was that they were all operating in an electronic environment, and that they were all had an electronic record keeping system, and their different level of social media use was different across the organisations. It was a qualitative research study, so I used semi-structured interviews as the main data gathering method, but I also looked at organisational policy documents to compare with how people talked about it. And I looked at a cross-section of professions. So the different government agencies were 3 medium-sized and 1 large, 2 inner government agencies, so non-corporate Commonwealth entities. So for those of you there, like inner government, and 2 outer autonomous agencies or corporate Commonwealth entities, and they were across 4 different portfolios. So, and who did I interview? Well, I interviewed the information and records management professionals first up to get some background to the agency, but mainly to give me context when I went to talk to everybody else. But I looked at, there's a human resources legal professionals. There's a typo for you. Human resources professionals, legal professionals, marketing and community. So mainly corporate people, but also actually some frontline staff in each agency as well. So, what did I find? So I've grouped them, as I outlined before, into 3 themes: the relatings, the sayings, and the doings. So the relatings are the socio-political arrangements, how everything relates to one another socially and politically. The sayings, what actually people say, the cultural discursive arrangements in an organisation, and the doings. So